He had worked on his land his entire life, expecting nothing but dust and stones, but one cracked boulder changed everything. When the farmer dug it out completely, he realized it was no ordinary rock. And when the experts arrived, they were left speechless by what they saw inside. Subscribe, watch our other videos, and tell us where you're watching from. The first light of dawn always reached Marlin's fields long before it warmed the roofs of the distant settlement, but even this soft glow could not hide how lifeless the earth looked. The land lay in uneven plates, scarred by years of drought and generations of failed hopes. Where other farms had even rows of crops, Marlin's property was scattered with stubborn stones and patches of dry grass that clung to the soil as if too tired to grow any further. Dust rose with every breeze, swirling along the ground before settling again, as though ashamed of disturbing the silence. This place had fought for life for decades and lost more battles than it won. Yet it remained the only home Marlin had ever known. He stepped out of the small wooden house that had been built by his grandfather, a structure that had survived storms, poverty, and time, but carried the marks of all three. One side of the roof had sagged just a little more since last year. The window frames were warped from the heat. The porch creaked under his weight, announcing his movements like an old friend unable to stay quiet. Marlin paused on the final step, letting his eyes sweep across the property. Every morning, he asked himself the same silent question. Could this land still give something, anything, if he just learned how to work it differently? And every morning, he chose to believe it could. He breathed in slowly, feeling the dryness of the air scrape gently against his throat. Rain had not visited this area for nearly 4 months, and the cracked patterns in the soil looked like a map of suffering. But Marlin had long learned that working land like this required more than physical strength. It required stubbornness, the kind that outlasted disappointment. It required waking up with the memory of yesterday's failures and still picking up the tools today. It required a hope that felt ridiculous to anyone else, but felt like survival to him. His family was still asleep. His wife curled under a thin blanket, his 2 children sharing their grandmother's room because they preferred to fall asleep to her stories about the old days before the land dried up. It was easier for them to dream when someone else carried the weight of fear. Marlin made sure they never saw his shoulders sag under it. He always smiled for them, always laughed with them, always promised that next season would be better. But there were nights when he lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, knowing he was one failed harvest away from losing everything. The tools leaned against the shed told their own long story. His hoe had been patched with an iron strip welded along the back, his father's idea after the handle split one scorching summer. The shovel had dents along the blade where it had repeatedly struck hidden stones. The tractor, a machine older than Marlin himself, sat in the shade of a crooked acacia tree, its faded paint peeling off like sunburned skin. He had repaired it so many times he could identify every sound it made. The cough before the engine caught, the metallic whine of tired gears, the sputter of an aging exhaust system. He walked towards the field he had chosen for today's work, a stretch of land his neighbors had long abandoned. They used to call it cursed soil, the kind that swallowed seeds and returned nothing. But Marlin believed that beneath the hardened surface there might still be a layer worth saving. His father used to say that land was like a wounded animal. If you treated it right, it could heal. If you pushed it too hard, it would fight back. And Marlin had spent his whole life trying to understand how to make this place forgive them all. He lifted the first clump of dirt with his shovel, feeling the vibration run through the handle into his palm. The ground was resistant, as if protecting something hidden beneath. He moved slowly, mindful of the strain on his back, but determined to break past the first stubborn layer. Sweat formed quickly despite the early hour, sliding down his temples and mixing with the dust. He worked carefully, shifting stones aside, loosening the soil around them, listening to the earth as though it were speaking a language he had learned as a child. Each strike of the shovel sent tiny sparks of pain up his arms, reminders that he was not as young as when he first claimed this patch of land. But he continued, driven not by youth but by necessity. His children deserved better than empty promises. His wife deserved better than counting coins before every visit to the town market. His mother deserved peace in her final years, not the constant worry of whether tomorrow's harvest would be enough. He was so focused on the rhythm of digging that he almost missed the subtle shift beneath the blade when the ground responded with a hollow, unfamiliar tone. He froze, puzzled. Soil usually groaned or cracked, but this sound was different. Dense, almost metallic. He knelt and swept away dirt with his calloused hands, revealing something smooth beneath the surface. It wasn't a rock, not in the way he knew rocks. This one was shaped too evenly, too precisely, as though time had polished it on purpose. The surface was cool even in the rising heat. Marlin brushed away more earth and exposed a broader curve. The object was large, possibly enormous, and its shape suggested something buried long before his family settled here. His heartbeat quickened not from fear, but from a strange instinctive awareness that he had touched something meant to stay hidden. He pushed more soil aside, breathing harder, driven now by curiosity that overpowered fatigue. His fingers traced the smooth arc, noticing faint ridges running across it. The color was darker than the surrounding stones, a deep slate tone that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. He tapped it lightly. The echo sounded distant and hollow, like knocking on an old drum, not on rock. For a moment, he sat back on his heels, confused. Nothing about this place had ever suggested it held secrets. The land was too poor, too barren, too ordinary. Yet here, beneath the failed crops and scattered stones, was something that didn't belong to this era. He glanced over his shoulder toward the house. Everyone was still asleep. It struck him then how alone he was with this discovery, how fragile and important this moment suddenly felt. He returned to digging with renewed intensity. A sense of urgency pressed on him from within, as if the object demanded to be freed. The soil resisted less the deeper he went, crumbling away as though eager to reveal more. Eventually, the object's true size began to emerge. It was massive, heavier than anything he had ever unearthed before. He realized he would never be able to lift it alone. The sun climbed higher, heating the air until the horizon shimmered. Marlin wiped his brow, leaving streaks of mud across his forehead. He studied the exposed surface again. The long ridge traced along the object looked like a natural seam, but too straight, too intentional. When he pressed lightly along the edge, he felt a faint vibration, as though something inside responded, or shifted, or waited. A shiver passed through him despite the heat. He couldn't explain the sensation, but it felt as though the earth had whispered a warning he was too determined to hear clearly. Still, he continued. He fetched the tractor, tightening the old chains around the buried shape. As the engine roared to life, the ground trembled slightly beneath his feet. He eased the tractor forward, slowly pulling until the chains strained with a metallic groan. The earth reluctantly gave way. After several attempts, the object shifted, breaking free from its ancient cradle with a low, resonant crack. Dust rose around it in a cloud, and the air smelled suddenly older, as if the very soil exhaled a memory held for ages. Marlin cut the engine and stared at what he had dragged into the open. The massive form lay before him like a sleeping giant. For a moment, he didn't move, struck by the weight of what he had done, aware that he had crossed a threshold he didn't fully understand. When the object settled onto the ground, the long seam running across its surface widened ever so slightly, revealing a sliver of something inside, something that was not stone, something that breathed the silence of a world older than his land, older than his family, older than all the forgotten dreams buried beneath this soil. It was in that moment Marlin understood. His life had just changed, and nothing on this land, or beyond it, would ever be the same again. The moment the massive object settled onto the ground, the thin seam Marlin had noticed earlier widened just enough for a sliver of darkness to appear between the two halves. It was barely perceptible at first, but as the dust drifted away on the hot breeze, the line seemed to pulse with the faint tension of something long confined and abruptly released. Marlin felt the change rather than heard it, a subtle shift in the air around him, as though the earth itself exhaled after centuries of silence. The sight rooted him to the spot. He stood there with his hands still on the tractor's steering wheel, afraid that even a breath would disturb whatever fragile moment he had triggered. He climbed down slowly, boots sinking into the dry soil, and approached the object with measured steps. The land beneath him felt different now, lighter in some places, strangely hollow in others, as if parts of the field had been holding their breath as well. He crouched near the seam and brushed away loose dirt with trembling fingers. The surface that emerged from beneath the dust possessed a texture no stone should have. It was too smooth in one place, too rigid in another, with faint patterns that looked neither carved nor naturally eroded. His fingertips glided over a set of ridges that curved with an irregular rhythm, almost biological in their structure. Nothing about this object made sense, yet everything about it demanded his attention. He tried to pry apart the seam with the edge of his shovel, but the tool vibrated unnervingly in his grip. It was as though the object resisted him not with strength, but with an ancient stubbornness, a refusal to surrender its secret until it was ready. Marlin hesitated. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, drowning out the chirps of distant insects buried in the tall grass at the edge of the field. The sun had risen high enough to bake the back of his neck, but he barely noticed. All he saw was the widening crack and the promise of something inside. He stepped back, unsure of what to do. His instinct told him to leave it alone, to walk away and pretend he had never unearthed it. But curiosity, mingled with a strange responsibility he hadn't felt before, overpowered his fear. He had touched something that didn't belong to this era, something that had waited beneath his feet for longer than he could comprehend. And now it seemed to be waiting for him to finish what he had started. He walked around the immense form, studying the ground to determine a better approach. The soil around the object was torn and uneven where the tractor had dragged it free. Sunlight glinted off small fragments that had chipped away during the extraction, revealing more of that dark, enigmatic surface beneath. The seam ran along the upper curve of the object like the fault line of a mountain, a single, vulnerable line on an otherwise impenetrable shell. Maybe it had always been there. Maybe the pressure of the earth had kept it sealed for millennia until his old machine strained against it with just the right force. The realization of how close he had been to damaging whatever lay inside made him swallow hard. He wiped his palms on his trousers and glanced back toward his house. The roof shimmered in the sun. The home he fought so hard to maintain felt suddenly smaller, fragile against the weight of what he had discovered. Something inside him whispered that nothing would remain the same after today. A man could toil on his land for a lifetime and see nothing but dust. But sometimes all it took was one unexpected moment for the earth to reveal something unimaginable. He returned to the object and placed both hands on one half, testing its weight. It didn't budge. He tried pushing the other half. Still, nothing. Despite its cracked appearance, the shell remained locked in place, as if the two pieces clung to each other with the determination of something that refused to surrender its contents easily. Frustration tinged his excitement. He needed help, real help, the kind he doubted anyone would offer a man like him. Still, he had no other choice. He climbed onto the tractor again, looped additional chains around the object, and pulled at a different angle. The engine groaned in protest. The tires spun, digging deeper into the earth before finally gaining traction. Slowly, painfully, the two halves began to shift apart. The seam widened. Dust fell in thin streams from the interior, revealing shadows where no sunlight had touched for ages. And then, with a jarring crack that echoed across the field like a gunshot, the object split open completely. The sound froze Marlin mid-motion. He jumped from the tractor and approached with wide eyes, hardly daring to breathe. The halves of the shell now leaned away from each other like enormous petals peeled back to reveal something at their center. And what he saw struck him with a force more powerful than fear. Inside the broken stone lay a form unmistakably shaped by life. At first, his mind refused to accept it. His brain tried to categorize what he was seeing: stone, sculpture, mineral formation, but the details rejected every explanation. The interior shape was preserved with an impossible clarity. A thick hide, textured like a mosaic of interlocking plates, wrapped around the upper surface. The plates themselves were edged with small ridges, the kind that suggested they had once been flexible, once part of a living creature's defense. Beneath the plates, subtle depressions hinted at muscle and bone. Near one end, an outcropping curved sharply, like the base of a spine that had stiffened into armor. The object was not carved. It was not shaped by human hands. It had grown this way. The truth settled in slowly, dangerously. This was once a living being. Marlin stepped closer. His shadow crossed the body inside the shell, and for an instant he imagined the creature moving beneath him, imagined it stirring after millions of years, imagined the plates along its back rising like the scales of some ancient giant awaking from slumber. The thought made him shudder, but the form remained still, silent, frozen in time. A crackle of dryness broke under his knee as he knelt to get a better look. He reached out with hesitant fingers, unsure if touching it would disrespect something sacred. He hovered his hand just above the preserved hide. The air rising from the cavity felt cooler, as though the interior still clung to the ancient cold of whatever world had birthed this creature. He lowered his hand and touched the surface lightly. The sensation startled him. It was not stone. Not entirely. There was a density beneath, something he couldn't name. Neither the warmth of life nor the dead chill of mineral. Something in between, like the echo of what it once had been. His throat tightened. He pulled his hand back and sat on the ground, overwhelmed. His entire life he had fought a land that offered him nothing. Now the same land had given him something beyond imagination. Something so extraordinary it belonged to history books, not the desperate fields of a failing farm. The sun climbed higher, marking time he no longer felt. He did not know how long he sat there, staring into the exposed cavity, but eventually reality returned, reminding him that he could not keep this discovery to himself. He stood slowly and walked toward his house, each step feeling heavier than the one before. Fear and excitement battled inside him. A poor man's word rarely carried weight. No one believed in the possibilities that lived on land like his. But the truth lay under the sky behind him, impossible to deny. He entered the house briefly, retrieved his old cell phone, and returned to the site. The camera struggled in the harsh sunlight, but he managed to take a series of photos from every angle he could reach. The images were blurred at the edges, miscolored in places, but the preserved creature was unmistakable. He stared at the last picture for a long moment. It looked unreal, almost like a creature from a museum exhibit, and yet it lay in his field, half buried in dust. When he finally turned away, it was with the weight of a man who understood he had uncovered not just a curiosity, but a secret that had slept beneath his family's land since time began. He knew he needed help. He knew he needed others to see what he had found. Yet, part of him dreaded what would happen when outsiders arrived. The land that gave him nothing had suddenly offered him everything, and he feared that the world would try to take it from him. Still, he could not leave it buried again, not after witnessing what lay inside. He headed toward the road, heart pounding with the first tremors of a destiny he never asked for but could no longer avoid. If anyone else had uncovered what he found, the world might have taken notice. But, coming from a poor farmer, he wondered whether anyone would believe that under his dehydrated soil, something older than time itself had been waiting to be discovered. He tightened his grip on the phone. Whether they believed him or not, he would make them see. His land, once dismissed and forgotten, had spoken. And now he had no choice but to answer. Marlin walked along the dusty road with the weight of the entire world pressing against his ribs. The phone in his hand seemed suddenly heavier than steel, containing images he wasn't sure he fully comprehended. The fields around him lay silent as they always had, but now the silence felt different. It felt watchful, as though the land itself waited to see what he would do next. Every few steps he glanced back at the shattered stone in the distance, half expecting the strange shape inside to shift or disappear, as though it might prove to be an illusion created by tired eyes and a desperate mind. But each time he looked, the two halves of the shell still lay open like ancient gates, revealing a being that should not have existed in his lifetime. When he reached the edge of the village, the sun had already risen past its gentle golden glow and burned bright against the horizon, harsh and unforgiving. Marlin shielded his eyes and hurried along the small street that held the administrative building. It was barely more than a one-room structure, a place where paperwork piled faster than solutions, with peeling paint and a roof patched with corrugated metal. The front door squeaked sharply when he pushed it open, announcing his arrival to the lone clerk inside. The man behind the desk looked up with a tired, uninterested expression, the kind worn by people who had learned not to hope for change. He recognized Marlin, but didn't straighten his posture or bother to hide his boredom. Marlin explained what he had found, choosing his words carefully, trying to avoid sounding as though he had lost his senses. But even as he spoke, he saw disbelief begin to darken the clerk's eyes. When he mentioned the cracked stone, the strange, smooth surface, and the form that looked alive despite being entombed in rock, the clerk sighed as if he had been through this before with other dreamers from the worn-out farmlands. It wasn't until Marlin held out the phone with trembling hands that the man's expression changed. The images were far from perfect, but they held enough clarity to silence any sarcastic remarks. The clerk leaned forward, squinting at the screen. When he zoomed in on the ridge-lined plates covering the creature's back, he blinked twice. His indifferent posture straightened. His lips parted slightly, as though the air around him had grown suddenly thinner. Without a word, he stood and disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a more senior official who carried a worn suit and an expression of constant skepticism. The second man studied the pictures with a frown. He murmured something under his breath that Marlin could not hear. Then he looked up, meeting Marlin's gaze for the first time with something other than dismissiveness. There was no excitement there yet, no belief, only a cautious curiosity, like a man faced with a puzzle he couldn't immediately explain. The conversation that followed was slow and filled with questions Marlin answered as best he could. Eventually, the officials exchanged glances, their whispered debate ending with a reluctant decision to call the regional authorities. Marlin stood outside the building after the calls were made, feeling both relieved and anxious. His hands trembled slightly, not from physical exertion but from the realization that he had crossed a threshold. Whatever happened next was no longer only his. The land had given him something vast, raw, mysterious, and now he had invited others to see it. Hours later, long after midday, heat began to weigh down the air. A convoy of dusty, white vehicles approached his farm. The sight startled his family, who stood on the porch watching as unfamiliar figures stepped out. His wife placed a hand on his arm, worry tightening her features. His children pressed close to her side, eyes wide with confusion. They had rarely seen outsiders with such purpose in their stride. His mother watched from the doorway, leaning on her cane, her face unreadable beneath the heavy lines that told stories of hardship. Marlin guided the group toward the field, feeling them crowd behind him with curious energy. The scientists and officials murmured among themselves, the crunch of gravel under their boots blending with the humid buzz of insects. Some carried measuring instruments, others notebooks, still others crates with equipment he didn't recognize. There were 2 university researchers, a pair of field geologists, and one man whose serious expression and well-worn satchel hinted at decades of paleontological work. They all expected to find something explainable, perhaps old machinery, mineral deposits, or debris from a long-forgotten structure. But the moment they came within sight of the split stone, the murmurs faded into an abrupt silence. Then the silence deepened into something like awe. One scientist stopped walking altogether. Another removed her hat, as if in the presence of something sacred. The paleontologist with gray hair stepped forward ahead of the group, his eyes widening in disbelief as he moved closer to the exposed creature. Marlin watched the man's stern expression crumble into raw shock. No one spoke for several seconds. It was as though the ground itself demanded silence in honor of what lay half exposed. The creature's armored hide captured the sunlight in a way that made it seem unreal, like something sculpted by a master craftsman from a material that refused to age. The plates along its back were arranged in interlocking patterns, perfectly preserved despite being buried for longer than human history could fathom. Every edge, every ridge, every curve told a story of a living form that once inhabited a world Marlin could barely imagine. One of the younger researchers knelt and traced the air above the exposed hide, careful not to touch it directly. She whispered something breathless and astonished to her colleague. The paleontologist knelt beside her, momentarily at a loss, His hands hovered over the fossil without touching, trembling slightly. It was the trembling of someone who had devoted their life to searching for fragments and shards of the ancient world, but had never expected to find an entire form so intact, so untouched by decay. He rose to his feet slowly, turning towards the officials who had accompanied him. His expression had transformed completely. The skepticism had evaporated, replaced by urgency and reverence. The officials exchanged uncertain glances, sensing the magnitude of the moment, but not yet understanding it. The scientists sprang into motion. They circled the exposed halves of the stone, taking photographs from every angle and marking the perimeter with flags. One woman tapped lightly on the outer shell with a specialized tool, listening to the echo. Another recorded the ambient temperature inside the open cavity. A third began sketching the exposed form, each stroke steady despite the excitement running through her. Marlin stood back, watching his quiet field transform into an impromptu research site. His emotions shifted between pride and fear as each action the experts took reaffirmed that he had found something extraordinary. But he also sensed something else in the air, an undercurrent of tension, a recognition that this discovery carried implications far beyond his understanding. A member of the team approached him, asking him to describe everything he had done since the moment he first struck the smooth surface. Marlin shared every detail, from the sound of the hollow thud to the vibration in the shovel to the moment the stone cracked apart. The scientist listened intently, scribbling notes. His voice softened when he asked whether Marlin had touched the interior, and when Marlin admitted he had, the man nodded slowly, not with reprimand, but with the understanding that any person would have done the same. The hours stretched on as more researchers arrived. Vehicles kicked up trails of dust as they parked along the edge of his fields. The sun began to lower itself across the horizon, casting an amber glow over the scene, but the investigators continued their work with unfading zeal. They set up temporary tents, tables, and shade canopies. They unpacked scanners, brushes, gloves, magnifiers, and specialized lights. They moved with a mixture of precision and barely contained wonder. No one compared the creature to anything familiar. The longer they studied its form, the clearer it became that nothing quite like it had ever been reported in this region. The armored ridges, the curvature of the plated hide, the subtle patterns along the edges, all pointed to a species known only in fragments. The paleontologist finally voiced the possibility with a tone that shook with disbelief. This might be something related to the nodosaur family, a creature that roamed the earth millions of years ago, armored and powerful. But unlike every fossil known to science, this one had not turned to stone alone. It had preserved its texture, its structure, perhaps even its secrets. The team's astonishment grew with each passing hour. What had begun as cautious interest escalated into something looking very much like historical significance. By the time dusk settled over the land, the site had been cordoned off with temporary fencing. Security personnel arrived to ensure no one disturbed the area overnight. Researchers prepared to work in shifts, unwilling to leave the specimen unobserved. Through all of it, Marlin remained on the edge of the activity, feeling like a man standing between two worlds. One was the world he had always known, simple, hard, defined by necessity. The other was the world opening before him now, where ancient creatures slept beneath his field and experts from distant places spoke his name with respect. He returned home late that evening, the sky streaked with the last traces of orange. His wife met him at the door, her face filled with concern. His children peeked from behind her, sensing something important had happened. His mother sat in her old rocking chair, watching him with eyes that carried an unspoken question. He told them what he could without overwhelming them. The children were amazed, whispering among themselves about the creature that had slept under their home. His mother nodded slowly, as though confirming a truth she had always suspected, that the earth held more secrets than people dared to believe. His wife listened quietly, placing a hand over his as though to anchor him to the life they shared. When Marlin stepped outside again before bed, he could see the glow of lights from the field. The researchers were still working, their silhouettes moving carefully around the split stone like priests around an altar. The land that had fought him for so long now held something priceless, and as he watched the distant figures, he sensed the first shift in the destiny of his home. He didn't yet understand what it meant. Not for him, not for his family, not for the region, but he knew it was something too large to comprehend in a single night. For the first time in his life, the land was no longer silent. It was speaking, and the world had come to listen. Night fell over Marlin's farm like a heavy velvet curtain, yet the field behind his house glowed as though a second sunrise had taken root in the soil. Floodlights cast tall, stretching shadows across the cracked earth, turning the familiar landscape into something strange and almost theatrical. The researchers worked through the darkness with the unwavering focus of people who feared that if they blinked too long, the discovery before them might vanish. Every few minutes, Marlin could hear the soft hum of their equipment, the quiet conversations carried by excitement, and the occasional exclamation that rose above the others before being swallowed by the vast night. It was surreal to stand outside his home and see the land, once overlooked by everyone, transformed into the heart of something monumental. By morning, exhaustion weighed on him, but anticipation overshadowed it. He barely slept, waking repeatedly to glance through the window at the distant lights. When dawn finally came, the lights dimmed but did not disappear. Instead, more vehicles arrived, crunching along the dry road like beetles making their determined approach. The rumble of engines drew clusters of curious neighbors to the fences. They whispered among themselves, their voices filled with awe. People who had never visited Marlin's field before wandered close now, eager to see what could possibly justify this sudden flood of outsiders. The community's excitement was nothing compared to what happened next. As the sun climbed higher, television crews began arriving. Some local, some from distant cities Marlin had only heard about on the radio. Their cameras glinted like metallic eyes, constantly searching for the best angle. Reporters adjusted their microphones as though preparing for war, their expressions sharp with hunger for a story that would elevate them in their stations. They hurried across the field with the urgency of hunters racing to claim a prize, shouting questions no one had time to answer. "Is it true a complete specimen was found?" one reporter asked, jogging beside a university professor who refused to break stride. "Is this the discovery of the decade?" another called out, while her cameraman tried to keep up. "Where's the farmer who found it? We need him on camera." Marlin stepped back, overwhelmed. He had never seen people so frantic over anything in his quiet community. A hand brushed his shoulder gently, pulling him aside before the crowd could swarm him. It was the paleontologist from the previous day, the man with silver hair and hands that trembled with reverence when he touched the creature's preserved armor. "You might want to stay behind the main line," he advised softly. "The press will be relentless. For now, let us help manage this." Marlin nodded gratefully, retreating towards the edge of the activity, where he could still see everything but would not be trampled under the journalist's ambitions. From his vantage point, he watched as the team unveiled more discoveries. In the early light, The creature's plates shimmered with a faint pattern that had been invisible the day before. The intricate arrangement of those plates suggested something far more sophisticated than simple armor. It spoke of evolution, adaptation, and a long-extinct world where creatures fought for survival in ways that modern imagination struggled to grasp. The scientists worked meticulously. Some brushed away the last clinging particles of soil with delicate tools. Others adjusted scanning equipment that bathed the interior of the shell in pulses of blue and white light. One researcher announced in a trembling voice that organic tissue might still be present. Another pointed out the curvature of the spine and murmured about biomechanics. Every observation was recorded, every detail labeled. For the first time in his life, Marlin felt that he stood on ground where history was not just remembered, but actively rewritten. Soon, the first official public statement was drafted and read aloud. The paleontologist spoke before the cameras with a voice that blended gravity and exhilaration. He explained that the creature was likely a form of nodosaur, an ancient, heavily armored herbivore, and that its preservation was nothing short of miraculous. He noted that the specimen was not merely fossilized but retained traces of original texture across the hide. The structure of the plates, the arrangement of the spikes, and the remarkable integrity of the form suggested something unprecedented. No one alive had ever seen such completeness. Within minutes, the news spread far beyond the borders of the village. Laptops in distant laboratories lit up with notifications. Phones buzzed in offices of museums across continents. By midday, the story had reached international headlines. Perfectly preserved dinosaur discovered by farmer. Armored giant unearthed in rural farmland. Unique nodosaur specimen could rewrite evolutionary history. The words felt detached from Marlin's reality. They belonged to another world, one he had never imagined he would be a part of. His neighbors whispered excitedly. Many had never met a scientist before, much less watched one speak on camera about their region as though it were a cradle of ancient wonders. Children climbed fences for a glimpse of the creature. Elderly men, who had spent their entire lives plowing the earth with worn tools, now stood motionless, marveling that beneath their feet something so extraordinary had always existed. But with wonder came something else, a shift in the region's pulse, a sense of awakening that Marlin had never witnessed. For generations, people in this settlement had accepted the idea that opportunity belonged elsewhere. They had watched their young leave for cities with brighter lights and smoother roads. They had endured droughts, shortages, and empty promises. The land had grown tired with them, and they with it. Yet now, as journalists shouted questions and scientists documented every detail, there was a sudden swell of pride. The region was no longer invisible. The world had turned its gaze here. A man from the government arrived by afternoon. He wore an impeccable suit that looked comically out of place against the dusty backdrop of the farm. He shook hands with the scientists and delivered statements about national interest, cultural heritage, and the need to secure the site. His bodyguards set up temporary barricades, restricting access to the area. When he approached Marlin, his smile was warm but calculated, the kind reserved for people whose cooperation mattered. "You made a remarkable discovery," he said in a tone that carried both admiration and expectation. "This land may be of significant scientific interest. We will need to assess the situation. Perhaps the state can acquire it from you." The words tightened something in Marlin's chest. The thought of losing the land his family had worked for generations, land tied to his father's sweat and his grandfather's hope, stirred a resistance he didn't know he possessed. Before he could respond, the paleontologist stepped forward. "This man is not to be pressured," he said firmly. "Without him, none of this would have been found. Respect his rights." The official smiled again, but it did not reach his eyes. He turned away to address reporters instead, leaving Marlin feeling both defended and exposed. Throughout the day, researchers shared early insights. The specimen appeared to belong to a previously undocumented subspecies. Differences in the ridge patterns and the unique composition of the armor hinted at evolutionary variations unseen in prior discoveries. The skin texture, preserved beneath the plates, suggested that pigmentation, actual color, might still be detected through future testing. That revelation alone sent shockwaves across the scientific community. To identify the coloration of a dinosaur was something paleontologists had only dreamed of achieving. By late afternoon, the field had transformed completely. White tents dotted the area like small islands of order. Cables stretched across the ground. Laptops hummed beside portable generators. The air carried the smell of dust and metal, mixed with a sharp tang of anticipation. Researchers passed each other with hurried steps, discussing preliminary data. Students from the university assisted in cataloging samples, while others studied long-range scans of the surrounding soil. Every person on site seemed propelled by the knowledge that they stood before a discovery that could reshape scientific understanding. As the sun dipped lower, casting warm hues across the land, a new group arrived. Children from a nearby school, led by teachers who could not resist the chance to let their students witness history. They stood behind the designated tape, whispering excitedly as they saw the creature. The thrill in their voices reminded Marlin of his own children, who had asked questions all morning, trying to imagine the world that creature once walked in. The presence of children seemed to soften the atmosphere. Researchers smiled, explaining bits of information to them in simple terms. One woman crouched down to show a group of boys how the creature's spikes aligned like a natural armor. Another man told the girl that this was the closest anyone in the modern world might ever come to seeing a dinosaur as it truly was. Their eyes lit up with awe, and for a brief moment, the barricades between science and community dissolved. But behind the excitement, Marlin sensed something else quietly shifting. People in the village who once struggled to make ends meet now spoke of possibilities. Some talked about opening small shops or food stalls to accommodate the steady stream of visitors. Others imagined the government improving roads for easier access. Even the most skeptical residents admitted that something new, something vibrant, had taken hold. Marlin returned to his house that evening as voices carried across the field. The lights made the land appear almost alive, glowing like the pulse of a long-forgotten world returning to consciousness. His wife met him with tired eyes but a proud smile. His children ran to him, eager for more stories about the creature. His mother rested in her chair, watching him with a knowing look that held both gratitude and caution. He stepped outside once more after tucking the children into bed. The night was warm, filled with the soft hum of generators and the distant murmur of scientists preparing for another long shift. The sky glittered with stars, unmoving, ancient, yet somehow less mysterious than the armored giant lying in his field. For generations, this land had offered little more than hardship, but now it had given him something breathtaking. A discovery that would echo across nations, reshaping not only the scientific world, but the destiny of his entire region. And, as Marlin stood beneath the starlit sky, he felt the truth settle into his heart. The land had awakened, and so had hope. He did not yet know the magnitude of what lay ahead, the negotiations, the decisions, the changes, but he sensed that everything was already in motion. The world had found its way to his doorstep, and the land was no longer silent. It whispered through the hum of the floodlights and the murmur of excited voices. It whispered of transformation. The following days unfolded in a blur of activity, each morning beginning with the distant rumble of arriving vehicles, and each evening ending with the glow of floodlights shimmering across the quiet plains. The once lonely field behind Marlin's home now resembled a bustling oasis of scientific fervor, a place where researchers from around the world converged with the eagerness of explorers stepping onto uncharted land. The novelty of witnessing the world's attention settle upon his small corner of the earth had not faded for Marlin. If anything, the deeper the experts delved into the mystery beneath his soil, the more aware he became of just how extraordinary this moment in time truly was. On the fourth morning after the discovery, Marlin walked toward the site slowly, adjusting to the changes that had become a part of his daily life. Rows of temporary shelters filled with instruments had sprouted like white metal flowers. Tables were covered with maps, soil samples, and carefully labeled vials. Soft hums from scanning devices blended with the rustle of papers and the occasional clatter of equipment being repositioned. The air carried the faint scent of heated metal and dust, mingling with aromas drifting from food stands that local residents had set up in response to the steady stream of visitors. The community had already begun adapting to its new reality. The paleontologist with silver hair, now formally introduced as Dr. Edmund Hollis, stood beneath one of the canopies reviewing a series of images captured from deep scan equipment. His expression held the same mixture of awe and concentration that Marlin had become accustomed to seeing. When Hollis noticed Marlin approaching, he motioned for him to come closer, pointing to a large tablet displaying a cross-sectional image. The image revealed layers beneath the cracked stone, stripes of lighter and darker mineral deposits curling around the preserved creature like halos trapped within the earth. "These scans tell a story," Dr. Hollis said softly, as though raising his voice might disturb the ancient layers still hidden below. "Not just of this creature, but of the land itself. This region may be far more significant than anyone realized." Marlin studied the image, even though its colors and shapes meant little to him at first glance. Hollis explained that the lighter sections represented mineral flows that had hardened quickly, while the darker areas had been compressed over eons. It was these mineral flows, rich in rare compounds, that likely accounted for the creature's miraculous state of preservation. The hardened, gel-like sediment that had buried the nodosaur had acted as a natural seal, preventing decay and protecting even the most delicate structures. As the professor spoke, his voice carried the tone of a man unraveling a riddle long thought unsolvable. More researchers gathered to examine the findings. Discussions swirled around theories of ancient landslides or sudden geological upheavals that could have engulfed the creature while its body was still intact. Marlin listened, absorbing whatever he could. Though he knew little about geology, he sensed that their excitement was deepening. This was no longer merely the discovery of a beautifully preserved dinosaur. It was the discovery of a unique geological phenomenon that held untold secrets within its layers. Around midday, a team of geologists invited Marlin to follow them to a section of the field where they had begun digging small, precise pits. They explained that they were examining the soil in search of clues, tiny mineral clusters, variations in sediment density, and anything else that might reveal the ancient events that shaped this land. The ground outside the excavation pit looked unremarkable to Marlin, but the scientists treated it with reverence, brushing away the soil gently as though they feared to disturb something sacred. Suddenly, one of the geologists, a woman with short hair and sharp eyes, held up a sample that glittered faintly. She explained that this particular mineral, though common in small quantities, had rarely been found in such dense concentrations. It was a substance known for its preservative properties, capable of creating near-perfect mummification when combined with rapid burial. Marlin felt a rush of astonishment as he realized that the extraordinary state of the creature had not been a matter of chance. The land itself had played a pivotal role. For millions of years it had protected the nodosaur like a sealed vault, holding its form untouched by time. The afternoon grew warmer, and clusters of scientists gathered under shaded tents to analyze the new information. Discussions grew spirited. Some argued that the mineral deposits suggested a sudden, violent event, a great flood or mudslide triggered by volcanic activity. Others believed the creature might have fallen into a natural sinkhole that rapidly filled with mineral-rich sediment. The debates continued as the researchers layered theory upon theory, building a vision of a prehistoric world far removed from the dry, exhausted fields of Marlin's present. As the conversations grew more animated, a group of visiting officials appeared once again, clearly more interested now that the scientific significance of the site had been firmly confirmed. They observed the excavation with newfound urgency, whispering among themselves as they studied the maps and documents. Their presence stirred the same anxiety within Marlin that he had felt days earlier. He had seen the glint in their eyes, the hunger to turn this land into something profitable, something controlled. He feared that, with enough pressure, they would try to claim the land as government property, leaving his family with nothing but memories. But it soon became clear that the scientists were not about to let that happen without protest. Dr. Hollis and several others openly argued that the land must remain partly in private hands, that Marlin's discovery was not only a scientific blessing, but also a testament to his stewardship. They emphasized that any future project should benefit the local community. Some suggested creating a protected research area or even a museum and educational center that would bring employment and opportunities to the region. For the first time, Marlin realized that he was not alone in this. People who barely knew him were now speaking on his behalf. By late afternoon, a new layer of excitement rippled through the field. A different scanning team had completed a deeper analysis, one that revealed something unexpected. Marlin was called over to view the results, and when he saw the images, he did not fully comprehend their meaning at first. Beneath the location where he had unearthed the nodosaur, the scans revealed an irregular shape embedded deep in the earth. It was large, distinct, and unmistakably separate from the creature already exposed. The researchers had found something else. Dr. Hollis explained that the shape was too smooth and too consistent to be random. It suggested the possibility of another fossilized structure, or perhaps a separate layer of preserved material. The shape could be another creature, another shell, or even a cluster of minerals encapsulated in a similar way. Whatever it was, it promised another discovery once the excavation expanded. Marlin felt his breath catch as whispers swept across the site. The land, it seemed, held more than one secret. The nodosaur might have been only the beginning. The rest of the day unfolded with renewed energy. Teams reorganized their schedules, preparing to dig deeper once their equipment was calibrated for safety. The excitement was tempered, however, by the realization that the next phase of excavation could take months, possibly years. The need for a long-term plan became undeniable. In the evening, as the sun dipped below the far hills, a meeting was held under the largest tent. Researchers gathered around a long table covered with charts and proposals. Marlin took a seat at one end, still uncertain of his place among them but encouraged by the warm nods he received. Dr. Hollis began by outlining the scientific potential of the site, not just the value of the nodosaur itself, but the unique geological composition of the land. He emphasized how rare it was to find such a perfect blend of conditions capable of preserving ancient organisms. The importance of the site extended far beyond a single specimen. It had the potential to become one of the most important paleontological resources in the world. But, more importantly, the professor stressed that any development should uplift the local community. He argued that the region, long forgotten by the country's planners and leaders, now had a chance to flourish in a way no one could have predicted. Roads could be improved, jobs could be created, educational programs for children could be established, and the farm, Marlin's farm, could become a place of knowledge and inspiration for future generations. When the meeting concluded, Marlin walked out into the cool evening air with a sense of clarity he had not felt in ages. The stars overhead glittered like fragments of ancient stories he had never known how to hear. Now, it seemed, he was learning to listen. The land that had resisted him for so long had not been refusing him. It had been protecting something vast, something powerful. And now that it had finally revealed its truth, he understood that the burden and the blessing rested not just on the earth, but on his shoulders as well. He returned home, where his wife waited with food kept warm on the stove, and his children clustered around the table with eager questions. His mother sat nearby, her wise gaze following him quietly. As he shared the discoveries of the day, he saw the awe in the children's faces, the hope in his wife's smile, and the quiet pride in his mother's eyes. They listened as though hearing the beginning of a story that belonged not just to him, but to all of them. And for the first time in his life, Marlin felt that the land beneath his feet was not his enemy. It was his legacy. It had chosen him, not because he was wealthy or powerful or trained in science, but because he had worked its surface with humility, patience, and faith. He had uncovered its ancient heart, and now it trusted him to protect it. He lay awake in bed long after his family fell asleep, thinking not about the struggles of survival, but about the promise of what lay ahead. The unknown shape beneath the soil felt like a heartbeat echoing through the ground. The land had more to reveal, and the world had more to learn. The truth, hidden in the depths, was emerging. And Marlin knew, with a certainty that settled deep within him, that the next chapter of his life, and of his land, was only just beginning. The first weeks after the revelation that another object lay buried beneath Marlin's field passed with an intensity that made the days blur together until they felt like a single, continuous breath. As scientists prepared new equipment and drafted excavation schedules, the site expanded outward like a living organism, growing new wings of tents, scaffolding, and shaded stations filled with humming machinery. The land behind Marlin's home transformed into something entirely unrecognizable. No longer a quiet stretch of soil, but a throbbing center of discovery, a place where past and present collided with electrifying force. And yet, even amid the rising tide of global attention, the land itself remained calm, patient, almost serene, as if it had expected this moment for ages, waiting for the right hands to uncover its secrets. The discovery of the second shape deep underground sent shockwaves through scientific circles. Articles appeared daily in major newspapers and online journals, each speculating about what might lie beneath the earth. Some believed it could be another dinosaur, perhaps even more intact than the first. Others thought it might be a mineral-encased ecosystem or a geological anomaly unlike any ever found. Whatever it was, the world was watching. And, with each passing day, more researchers requested access to the site, hoping to contribute to the unfolding mystery. Marlin found himself wandering through the organized chaos of the excavation with a quiet awe that never diminished. He had become a familiar figure at the site, greeted with nods of respect by people he had never imagined meeting in his lifetime. Students offered him coffee. Journalists asked for quotes. Officials introduced him at meetings as the discoverer of the century. Yet, despite all the attention, he remained grounded, speaking softly, moving carefully, watching more than he spoke. It wasn't humility alone that shaped his demeanor. It was something deeper, a sense of gratitude to the land and an understanding that he had been trusted with something ancient, fragile, and irreplaceable. The second excavation began cautiously. Teams used ultra-sensitive equipment to map the soil layer by layer. As days turned into weeks, they unraveled a picture that left them stunned. Beneath the ground, partially encased in mineral sediment similar to that which had preserved the nodosaur, rested the skeletal outline of what appeared to be another creature, larger, heavily armored, and positioned as though its fall had been sudden, violent, and final. The exact details would take years of study to confirm, but even the early findings suggested that Marlin's land was not simply a place where one extraordinary specimen had been preserved. It was a burial ground of wonders, a vault of prehistoric history untouched by time. When the news spread, the region erupted with a kind of collective renaissance. Roads that had been cracked and neglected for decades were suddenly prioritized by the government. Work crews arrived to lay fresh gravel and smooth asphalt, connecting the village to the main highway for the first time in years. Businesses emerged seemingly overnight. Food stalls, souvenir stands, small cafes with chalkboard menus offering fresh-baked bread and strong coffee to scientists and tourists alike. Some of the residents who had left in search of better opportunities returned, drawn by the promise of a future they had never imagined possible. Amid these changes, the plan for a permanent scientific facility took shape. A consortium of universities, museums, and research foundations proposed building an integrated paleontological research center directly on Marlin's land. The center would include laboratories, classrooms, preserved dig sites, a visitor center, and a museum showcasing the nodosaur and any future discoveries. The proposal was ambitious, perhaps even overwhelming, but the enthusiasm behind it was fervent. Experts argued that such a facility would not only safeguard the fossils, but also establish the region as a global epicenter for paleontology. The initial designs were brought to Marlin's home for review. Architects and officials spread large blueprints across his old kitchen table, the paper nearly brushing the floor. They explained every element of the design, pointing out where the laboratories would be located, where the museum entrance would stand, how the structure would blend with the land instead of dominating it. They were careful, almost reverent, as though seeking his approval was an essential step in honoring the land itself. Marlin listened attentively, hands clasped on the table, his family gathered around him. His children stared at the drawings with bright, eager eyes. His wife listened quietly, occasionally exchanging glances with him. His mother, though she spoke little, nodded approvingly at the mention of educational spaces for local children. When the officials finished their explanation, they asked Marlin if he would grant the land for the project. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. He leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. For years, the land had given him hardship. Now it offered him a choice, one that would shape not just his family's future, but the destiny of the entire region. He agreed, but with conditions. The project must employ local residents. The region must benefit from the revenue. Children must have free access to educational programs. The land must remain partly under his family's stewardship, and most importantly, the facility must be built in a way that respected the history beneath the soil. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but his resolve did not. The officials accepted his terms without hesitation. They had sensed from the beginning that Marlin was not motivated by wealth or recognition. He wanted something deeper, the chance to transform his land from a symbol of scarcity into a wellspring of possibility. Construction began months later, and the transformation was astounding. Tower cranes lifted beams into place, their silhouettes striking against the sunset. Workers poured foundations with careful precision, mindful of the delicate ground beneath. Architects designed the buildings to follow the natural contours of the land, weaving the new structures seamlessly into the landscape. Pathways were laid with local stone, and viewing platforms were built above excavated sites so visitors could look down upon the ancient layers without disturbing them. Throughout the construction, Marlin remained a constant presence. He walked the grounds each day, greeting the workers, answering questions, and quietly ensuring that the land was treated with the respect it deserved. His reputation grew beyond the village. Stories spread of a humble farmer whose discovery had changed the world, whose heart remained tied not to fame, but to his community. In tandem with the research center, Marlin launched initiatives of his own. With funds granted to him as the land's original owner, he financed improvements throughout the region. He donated to the local school, transforming a deteriorating structure into a vibrant campus with new books, new technology, and a playground for children who had never had one. He oversaw the reconstruction of the community's water wells, ensuring clean access to every household. He created a scholarship fund for youth who dreamed of studying science, engineering, or medicine. And he partnered with doctors to establish a small clinic, giving residents medical care that had once been a long, expensive journey away. His actions changed lives. Families who had been trapped in cycles of poverty found new hope. Children who had once stared longingly at maps of other places now spoke confidently of becoming paleontologists, teachers, or engineers. Even the elders, who had borne the weight of hardship for so long, began to smile again as they watched the region revive. When the research center finally opened its doors, it did so with a ceremony attended by officials, scientists, journalists, and residents alike. The nodosaur, preserved with a painstaking care, stood proudly in the main hall, a silent witness to the journey that had brought them all together. Visitors walked its length in awe, marveling at the texture of its hide, the patterns in its armor, and the sheer power the creature must have wielded in life. Children pressed their faces against the clear barrier, imagining it walking through forests millions of years ago. At the ceremony, Dr. Hollis gave a speech filled with gratitude for the discovery, the land, and the community. He spoke of the scientific breakthroughs yet to come, of the profound significance of preserving history, and of the humble man who had made all of this possible. Then he stepped aside and invited Marlin to speak. Marlin approached the podium slowly, the applause washing over him like a wave he could barely comprehend. He looked out at the faces before him, people who had traveled from far distances, people from his village, his family standing proudly in the front row. He cleared his throat, his voice quiet but steady as he began. He did not speak like a trained orator. He spoke like a man who knew the land intimately, who had felt every stone beneath his boots, who had fought against drought and despair. He spoke of his ancestors, who had tilled the same fields and dreamed of a better future. He spoke of the discovery that had changed everything. He spoke of gratitude toward the scientists who treated his land with respect, toward his family who supported him, and toward the earth itself for revealing its ancient heart. His final words echoed in the hall with a resonance no one expected, that the land did not belong to him alone, but to the generations who had walked it before him and the generations who would walk it after. He ended by saying that he hoped the center would inspire children to look at the ground beneath their feet, not as something barren or broken, but as something alive with possibility. The applause that followed lasted long after he stepped down from the podium. And in that moment, Marlin felt something he had never felt before, not just pride, but fulfillment. The land had chosen him to carry its secrets into the light, and he had honored that trust. Outside, dusk settled over the plains, bathing the new structures in soft golden light. The research center glowed like a beacon of knowledge and hope, a monument to both ancient life and the modern world's endless curiosity. People lingered on the walkways, their voices carried by the warm evening breeze. And as Marlin stood among them, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had become the heart of a transformation that reached far beyond his farm. His discovery had changed the future of his region, breathed new life into his community, and touched the world of science in ways that would echo for generations. Marlin, once a poor farmer fighting unyielding soil, had become the guardian of a treasure older than time, and now he was the hero of his land. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe, watch our next videos, and share this one with your friends. Your support helps us bring you more stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from.